Every time you sit in a math class, you are being lied to. You are handed a textbook filled with the names of European geniuses: Pythagoras, Fibonacci, Descartes, Newton. You are taught that mathematics, the very language of the universe, is a fundamentally Western invention. You are told that the ancient Greeks laid the foundation of logic, and the brilliant minds of the European Enlightenment built the modern world upon it. It is a story designed to make you believe that reason, science, and the capacity to understand the cosmos are uniquely European traits. But the foundational language of the modern world was not written in English, or French, or Latin. It was written in Sanskrit and Arabic, and then it was systematically, deliberately plagiarized by the West. This is the buried record, and today we are peeling back the layers on the mathematics heist and how Europe plagiarized the language of the universe. What follows is the story they absolutely do not want you to know. If you are the kind of person who questions what you have been taught, if you want to know the actual history of human intelligence, you are in the right place. Hit subscribe. We dig into buried records like this every single day. Let us start by looking at the official timeline, the version of mathematical history you were tested on in school. The textbook paints a very specific, highly curated picture. It starts in ancient Greece, men in white togas drawing triangles in the sand. We are told they invented pure geometry. Then, the Roman Empire falls, and Europe supposedly enters the Dark Ages. The timeline goes blank for a few centuries. But do not worry, because the textbook tells us that Europe eventually wakes up. During the Renaissance, a smart Italian man named Fibonacci supposedly brings modern numbers to the masses. René Descartes invents the coordinate plane. And then, the ultimate climax of human intelligence occurs. Isaac Newton sits under an apple tree, invents calculus, and single-handedly decodes the mechanics of the solar system. This narrative is incredibly powerful. It creates the foundational myth of the scientific revolution. It tells us that European minds are simply wired for higher-level abstraction. It frames the rest of the world as mathematically illiterate, waiting for the West to arrive and calculate their salvation. But if you actually dig into the historical archives, if you look at how Europe was actually functioning before they absorbed Eastern knowledge, that beautiful narrative completely collapses. To understand the sheer scale of the intellectual theft, you have to look at what European mathematics actually looked like during the Middle Ages. It was not a system of logic. It was an absolute, unworkable nightmare. Before the West stole the modern number system, they relied entirely on Roman numerals. Think about how Roman numerals work. They are just letters stacked next to each other. I, V, X, L, C, D, M. It looks very grand and imperial, carved into the side of a marble building. But try actually using them. Try doing long division with Roman numerals. Try multiplying 144 by 24. You cannot do it. There is no spatial logic. There is no column for tens, or hundreds, or thousands. If you were a European merchant trying to calculate your taxes, or a builder trying to measure a cathedral, you could not do it on paper. You had to use a physical abacus, moving wooden beads back and forth on a board, and then write down the final result in clunky Latin letters. European mathematics was completely paralyzed. They could not advance. They could not build complex financial systems. They could not map the stars with precision. They were mathematically trapped in the mud. Now, zoom out from the mathematical dark age of Europe and look at the Indian subcontinent. Thousands of miles away, ancient Indian mathematicians were not struggling with wooden beads. They were executing a massive, paradigm-shifting conceptual leap. As early as the 3rd century BCE, the Indians developed the Brahmi numerals. These were distinct, individual symbols for the numbers 1 through 9. They were not letters. They were unique, highly efficient characters. This is the absolute foundation of the numbers you use every single day. Look at a modern number 3 or a number 7. You are not looking at a European invention. You are looking at an evolved piece of ancient Indian typography. But having distinct symbols for 1 through 9 was not the real breakthrough. The true miracle of Indian mathematics, the invention that literally unlocked the universe, happened roughly around the 5th century CE. An astronomer and mathematician named Aryabhata, and later Brahmagupta, fully conceptualized a terrifying, world-shattering idea: nothingness. They invented the number 0. To the modern mind, zero seems obvious, but to the ancient Western mind, zero was an absolute paradox. The Greeks and the Romans had completely rejected the idea of nothingness. Their entire philosophy was based on tangible, physical geometry. If you cannot draw it, if you cannot hold it in your hand, it does not exist. How can you have a number that represents nothing? The West was terrified of the void. But the Indian civilization, deeply rooted in philosophical concepts of eternity, the cosmos, and the infinite cycle of the universe, had no problem embracing the void. They called it shunya, which means empty. They drew it as a simple dot, which eventually became a circle. When you combine the numbers 1 through 9 with the concept of zero, you create positional notation. Suddenly, the placement of a number dictates its exact value. A 1 next to a 0 is 10. Add another 0, it is 100. This was not just a new way to write down a quantity, it was a technological superweapon. With this system, you did not need a physical abacus anymore. You could do incredibly complex calculations, fractions, and massive astronomical equations using nothing but a piece of paper and a pen. It was infinitely scalable. You could calculate the distance to the moon or the debt of an entire empire, all on a single scroll. This mathematical revolution did not stay in India. Through the massive, booming trade routes of the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean, these numerals traveled west. They reached the glittering capital of the Islamic Golden Age, Baghdad. In the 8th and 9th centuries, while European kings were still signing their names with rough X's because they could not read, the Islamic world was building massive libraries, grand observatories, and translating every piece of global knowledge they could find. The Arab and Persian scholars looked at the Indian number system and immediately realized its absolute superiority. They adopted it, they refined it, they used it to map the curvature of the Earth and calculate the precise movements of the planets. They created a massive, thriving, highly advanced mathematical culture that completely dwarfed anything happening in Europe. The mathematical center of gravity was entirely in the East. The language of the universe had been written, and it was actively powering the most advanced civilizations on Earth. Europe was completely blind to it. They were still carving clunky Roman letters into wax tablets. But the geographic isolation of Europe was about to end. The Crusades and the expansion of trade routes were about to force the West to confront the intellectual supremacy of the Islamic world. And when the West finally discovered the mathematical wealth of the Middle East and India, they did not just borrow it. They launched a massive, systemic campaign to absorb the genius, erase the original authors, and claim the entire system as a triumph of European intelligence. And the greatest theft of all started with a Persian genius who literally invented the algorithms that run your entire life today. The year is roughly 820 CE. We are in Baghdad, the beating heart of the Abbasid Caliphate. The city houses a massive intellectual academy known as the House of Wisdom. While European monks are hunched over freezing desks in stone monasteries, struggling to count their harvest with Roman numerals, the scholars of the Islamic world are undertaking the largest translation and scientific synthesis project in human history. And walking through the halls of this massive library is a Persian polymath named Muhammad ibn Musa Al-Khwarizmi. Al-Khwarizmi is not just studying mathematics, he is about to completely revolutionize human logic. He looks at the Hindu numeral system, with its brilliant inclusion of zero, and he realizes it can be used for far more than just basic addition and subtraction. He realizes you can use these numbers to solve complex, abstract problems where some of the information is missing. He writes a monumental textbook. The title, translated, is the compendious book on calculation by completion and balancing. But it is the Arabic word for completion in the title that changes the world. The word is Algebra. When you sit in a high school classroom and struggle with equations, you are studying algebra. Al-Khwarizmi literally invented the systematic, step-by-step rules for solving linear and quadratic equations. He completely detached mathematics from physical, geometrical objects and turned it into an abstract, universal language. But the intellectual debt the modern world owes to this Persian genius does not stop at algebra. When Al-Khwarizmi's books were eventually translated into Latin centuries later, the European translators struggled to pronounce his name. They Latinized Al-Khwarizmi into algorithmi. Listen to that word, algorithmi. Every time you open your phone, every time a computer program runs, every time a social media feed curates a video, it is running on an algorithm. The absolute foundational concept of modern computer science, the systematic sequence of logical instructions, is literally just the mispronounced name of a 9th century Muslim scholar. Every tech billionaire in Silicon Valley, every aerospace engineer, and every modern financial system owes their entire existence to the mathematical architecture built by Al-Khwarizmi. So, how did Europe finally get their hands on this world-shattering technology? How did the Hindu-Arabic numerals finally cross the Mediterranean? The Western textbook will tell you a sanitized, heroic story about an Italian mathematician named Fibonacci. In the early 13th century, Fibonacci supposedly writes a book that introduces modern numbers to Europe, dragging the continent into the light of mathematical literacy. He is celebrated as a pioneer, but the buried record reveals that Fibonacci was not a pioneer. He was simply a student of the East. Fibonacci was the son of a Pisan merchant. As a young man, he did not study in the great universities of Europe, because those universities possessed absolutely no advanced mathematical knowledge. He traveled to Baghdad, a port city in modern-day Algeria, in North Africa. He sat in the classrooms of Arab mathematicians. He was actively taught the Hindu-Arabic numeral system and the algebraic methods of Al-Khwarizmi. When Fibonacci returned to Italy and wrote his famous book, Liber Abaci, in 1202, he was not inventing anything. He was acting as a translator. He was desperately trying to convince European merchants to abandon their clunky Roman numerals and adopt the vastly superior Islamic accounting methods. And how did the brilliant, supposedly enlightened minds of Europe react to being handed the perfect numerical system? They banned it. The European establishment, both the church and the state, reacted with absolute, terrified xenophobia. They looked at the number 0, the beautiful Indian shunya, and they called it demonic. To the deeply rigid medieval European mind, a symbol that represented nothingness was considered a tool of the devil. Furthermore, European merchants and bankers argued that these new, curvy Arabic numbers were too easy to forge. They claimed that a fraudster could easily change a 0 into a 6 or a 9. In 1299, the city of Florence passed a law explicitly banning the use of Arabic numerals in accounting. They legally mandated that merchants must return to using Roman numerals or spelling words out entirely. The West was literally trying to outlaw the language of the universe. It took centuries of agonizing, stubborn resistance before Europe finally swallowed their pride, abandoned their useless Roman letters, and fully adopted the Hindu-Arabic system. They did not invent the math. They fought it. They criminalized it. And only when they realized their economy would completely collapse without it did they finally steal it. But the theft of basic numbers and algebra is only the first layer of the mathematics heist. To find the ultimate historical cover-up, the most heavily guarded secret of the scientific revolution, we have to move to the 17th century. We have to talk about calculus. If you ask any Western scientist to name the absolute pinnacle of European intellectual triumph, they will point to the invention of calculus. It is the mathematics of continuous change. Without calculus, you cannot calculate the orbit of a planet, you cannot build a modern bridge, and you absolutely cannot launch a rocket into space. The textbook tells you that in the late 1600s, two brilliant European men, Isaac Newton in England and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz in Germany, independently invented calculus. We are taught the famous story of Newton sitting under an apple tree, watching the apple fall, and suddenly conceptualizing the mathematics of gravity and motion. Newton and Leibniz are framed as absolute gods of logic. Their invention is treated as a miraculous, spontaneous spark of European genius that occurred completely in a vacuum. It is the foundational pillar that proves Western intellectual supremacy. But if you look closely at the mathematical records of the Indian subcontinent, the Newton myth completely shatters. The buried record proves that calculus was not born in a British orchard. It was born over 250 years earlier on the southwestern coast of India. Let us travel to the 14th century, to the Kerala School of Astronomy and Mathematics. The undisputed genius of this school was a man named Madhava of Sangamagrama. Madhava and his brilliant students were obsessed with the stars. They needed to calculate the exact, precise positions of the planets for astronomical and navigational purposes. But to do this, they encountered a massive mathematical wall. They needed to calculate the exact values of trigonometric functions, like sine and cosine, for any given angle. Traditional geometry could not solve this problem. So, Madhava made a leap of logic that fundamentally altered the trajectory of human knowledge. He discovered infinite series. He realized that you could calculate a complex, non-linear function by breaking it down into an infinite sum of increasingly smaller fractions. If you keep adding these fractions forever, you get closer and closer to the exact true value. This is the absolute, undeniable bedrock of calculus. It is the concept of the limit. It is the mathematics of the infinite. Centuries before Isaac Newton was even born, Madhava and the mathematicians of Kerala had already written down the infinite series for sine, cosine, and arctangent. They had accurately calculated the value of pi to 11 decimal places using this exact method. They had laid down the entire mathematical architecture that Newton and Leibniz are globally credited with inventing. Western historians, for centuries, have desperately tried to protect the Newton myth. When confronted with the undeniable, physical manuscripts of the Kerala school, the standard Western defense is to claim it was just a coincidence. They argue that yes, the Indians discovered it first, but they were isolated. They claim that Newton and Leibniz must have independently reinvented the exact same complex mathematical theories centuries later. They ask you to believe in a miraculous parallel stroke of genius. But the buried record rarely relies on miracles. It relies on trade routes. It relies on ships and paper and heavily motivated translators. Because in the 16th century, the Kerala region of India was not isolated at all. It was crawling with Europeans. Specifically, it was crawling with Jesuit missionaries. The Catholic Church in Europe was facing a massive crisis. Their calendar was completely broken. They needed precise astronomical data to fix the dates of religious holidays, and they needed advanced mathematics to improve oceanic navigation for their expanding colonial empires. So, the Pope dispatched highly educated Jesuit scholars directly to India. And where did these Jesuits set up their headquarters? Directly in the Kerala region, right in the backyard of the most advanced mathematical school on the face of the earth. These Jesuit missionaries were not just preaching. They were explicitly ordered to collect local scientific and mathematical knowledge. They learned the local language, Malayalam. They actively sought out the Indian astronomers. They physically handled the highly advanced navigational charts and mathematical manuscripts that contained the infinite series of Madhava. And they put those translated manuscripts on ships and sent them directly back to the academic centers of Europe. They sent them back just decades before Isaac Newton and Gottfried Leibniz made their miraculous, isolated discoveries. The timeline is completely damning. The Jesuit scholars in Kerala, men like Matteo Ricci, were deeply connected to the absolute center of European scientific thought, the Collegio Romano. They were actively sending detailed reports, navigational charts, and massive volumes of translated texts back to the very libraries where the fathers of the European scientific revolution were studying. Europe was desperately searching for the exact mathematical tools required to calculate planetary motion and longitude at sea. The Kerala school possessed the most accurate trigonometric tables and the absolute mathematical formulas for infinite series in the entire world. And then, less than a century after these Jesuit ships arrived back in European ports, European mathematicians suddenly, miraculously, invented the exact same infinite series. The West did not invent calculus in a vacuum. They imported the foundational architecture from India, applied it to European physics, and then executed one of the most successful intellectual cover-ups in human history. But how did they actually pull off this massive, systemic erasure? How do you take the combined intellectual output of the Islamic Golden Age and the ancient Indian subcontinent and convince the entire world that it was a purely European creation? You do it through the violent power of the printing press and a deliberate campaign of Latinization. During the Renaissance, European scholars realized they were centuries behind the East. So, they began a frantic, massive translation movement. They traveled to libraries in Spain, which had been under Islamic rule for centuries, and they literally pillaged the Arabic texts. They took the mathematical masterpieces of the Middle East, the astronomical charts of Persia, and the algebraic treatises of Baghdad, and they aggressively translated them into Latin. But when they printed these new Latin textbooks, they made a highly calculated, deeply prejudiced editorial decision. They simply stopped printing the names of the original Eastern authors. If a name was too famous to ignore, they violently Latinized it to make it sound European. We already know Al-Khwarizmi was stripped of his identity and turned into the word algorithm. But the heist was systemic. The brilliant Persian polymath Ibn Sina, who wrote the foundational medical and mathematical texts used in Europe for 500 years, was rebranded as Avicenna. The great Arab physicist and mathematician Ibn al-Haytham, the absolute father of modern optics, was renamed Al-Hazen. They took the greatest minds of the Eastern world, stripped them of their cultural identity, and dressed them up in European academic robes. And for the mathematical concepts themselves, the European establishment simply started slapping their own names onto theorems that had existed in the East for centuries. When you study mathematics today, the erasure is absolute. You are taught Pascal's triangle, a famous mathematical pattern supposedly discovered by the French mathematician Blaise Pascal in the 17th century. The buried record proves that this exact same triangle was mapped out by the Persian mathematician Omar Khayyam and the Chinese mathematician Yang Hui over 500 years before Pascal was even born. You are taught the Fibonacci sequence, the famous numerical pattern found in nature. The buried record proves that this exact sequence was heavily documented by ancient Indian mathematicians like Virahanka and Pingala, nearly 1,000 years before Fibonacci ever traveled to North Africa. You are taught the Pythagorean theorem, the absolute bedrock of geometry, credited to the ancient Greek philosopher Pythagoras. The buried record proves that the ancient Babylonians, the Chinese, and the Indian mathematicians who wrote the Baudhayana Sutras had already discovered, documented, and actively used this exact mathematical relationship centuries before Pythagoras ever existed. The Western mathematical curriculum is essentially a massive plagiarized textbook. Europe did not invent the language of the universe. They just acted as the final editor. They collected the data from the Silk Road. They translated the brilliance of Baghdad and Kerala. They compiled it into printed Latin books, and then they aggressively ripped the original title page out and wrote their own names on the front. This is the deadly psychological core of the scientific revolution. We are taught to view the 16th and 17th centuries in Europe as a miraculous explosion of human intelligence. We are told that the West woke up from the Dark Ages and built the modern world entirely on their own. This narrative completely ignores the fact that the scientific revolution was actually just a massive, delayed absorption of Eastern data. Europe was not the sole author of human progress. They were a civilization that was mathematically bankrupt, struggling with Roman numerals and wooden abacuses, until they finally swallowed their pride and imported the numbers, the algebra, and the calculus of the East. But admitting that would shatter the illusion of Western intellectual supremacy. If the European empires admitted that their entire financial system, their navigational supremacy, and their understanding of physics were entirely dependent on the mathematical genius of the brown-skinned, non-Christian populations they were actively colonizing and enslaving, the entire moral justification for global European dominance would collapse. You cannot claim to be the intellectual savior of the world when you are using the math of the people you are subjugating to calculate the trajectory of your cannons. So, they controlled the curriculum. They wrote the textbooks. They built massive statues of Newton and Descartes. And they systematically erased Madhava, Al-Khwarizmi, and Brahmagupta from the timeline of human intelligence. This is the ultimate perception overturn. The next time you open a mathematics textbook, the next time you type an equation into a computer, the next time you hear someone praise the unmatched, inherent genius of the Western mind, remember the buried record. Remember the number 0, born from the Indian philosophy of the void. Remember the algorithms of Baghdad that run our digital world. Remember the infinite series mapped out by the astronomers of Kerala centuries before the West understood the mathematics of change. The foundation of modern logic, the architecture of the cosmos, and the very numbers you use to count your own age were not born in a European university. They were born in the East. The West didn't write the language of the universe. They just stole the dictionary. Everything you just heard is documented. It is in the untranslated Arabic manuscripts of the House of Wisdom. It is in the palm leaf mathematical texts of the Kerala school. The timeline of the Jesuit missionaries is an undeniable historical reality. The question isn't whether it's true. The question is, why weren't you taught this? If this completely changed how you see the history of mathematics and the myth of European scientific supremacy, share it with someone who needs to hear this. And if you want to go deeper, the buried record has a lot more to reveal. Subscribe, and we will keep digging.